Thank you to the funding organizations that have helped to make this conference possible and to make your participation and your presence here possible. But I don't have a list of those funding organizations, so I refer you to the LGBTQ website. That is the website of the LGBTQ study group, where all of those sponsoring organizations are, in fact, listed. But let's have a round of applause for the four organizers, Hetty, Emily, Stefan, and David, and for those funding organizations. And now it's my great honor to introduce the first of our two keynote speakers this afternoon. Alisha Lola Jones is an assistant professor of ethnomusicology in the Department of Folklore and Ethnomusicology at Indiana University, Bloomington. Dr. Jones is a graduate of the University of Chicago, Yale Divinity School, Yale Institute of Sacred Music, and Oberlin Conservatory. She's received academic acclaim and support for her research in her final dissertation writing year with fellowships from Andrew W. Mellon, the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture, and the Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality, the Martin Marty Center, and the Frank Institute for the Humanities, among others. As a performer scholar, Dr. Jones has done field work and led workshops on religious music and masculinity throughout the world. This spring, she received a College of Arts and Humanities Institute grant to expand upon research on music of the African diaspora to the Pacific Islands, focusing on Pacific African American women's musical and artistic responses to the Black Lives Matter and Say Her Name movements in the U.S. territory of Guam. In the fall of 2016, she was named an Innovator in Community Organization by the Harvard Divinity School Initiative in Ministry Innovation. During this current academic year, she's been invited to deliver keynotes for entities such as Yale, the United Nations, and the Institute for the Future in Silicon Valley, California. Her title is Behind Me, broadcast very loudly, and so without further ado, I'll turn the floor over to you, Alicia.
Thank you all so very much. First, thank you to the organizers for thinking of me and including me in this symposium. I'm so humbled and honored. Each and every one of you, as I think of the invitation, have been so supportive of me and my growth through the years. And so I again, am so appreciative of this opportunity to share my work in progress with you all. As you see, the name of the presentation that I have prepared for you today is You Are My Dwelling Place, Experiencing Black Male Vocal Worship as Autoeroticism and Gospel Performance. And I look forward to the conversation that will follow our time together. Within 21st century historically Black Pentecostal settings where gospel music is performed, there is a long-standing tradition of presenting songs and delivering sermons that promote sexual abstinence among unmarried individuals, encouraging them to wait to have sex until they get married. Essential prescriptions for maintaining chastity in the worth the wait movements are teachings that Christian believers should guard their hearts and minds from lust, pornography, and even masturbation. Following Black men's narratives about singing gospel, I contend that sexual abstinence discourse obscures the alternative forms of sensual and sexual exploration occurring in gospel music participation. Excuse me. Noticing the religio-cultural function on sexual abstinence rhetorics, many religious scholars have focused on the ways in which such teachings foster anxieties about the meanings and implications generated from the use of the body for pleasure and arousal. However, in my research on Black men's performance of sexuality and gospel, I have found a music-centered contradiction to these sexual abstinence teachings. In the vocal pedagogical language and imagery that voice teachers and directors deploy to teach good singing, Mentors make references to sensations perceived in the genitalia and other erogenous zones so that the vocalist can achieve supported breathing, and ideal placement in the production of vibrant sound, also known as resonance. Black male performers are encouraged to draw from their sexual experience and/or imagination to simulate sensed and sung sexual climax, while simultaneously using sonic iconicity and resonance to evoke transcendence in listeners during the facilitation of public worship. Further, outside of Black church music academies, these male musicians have encountered non-Black instructors' use of similar sexually suggestive and vulgar pedagogical imagery that is problematically derived from essentialist perceptions of Black men, emphasizing their physical attributes and sexual prowess over physical sensations and spiritual vitality. Examining ethnography in Washington, D.C. of Charles Anthony Bryant's musical tribute to Richard Smallwood by performing his composition, I Give You Praise, and interviews with male gospel vocalists and preachers, I consider gospel music as an embodied sexual activity in which vocalists simultaneously experience and surrogate pleasure as an essential, unspoken feature of worship leadership. In this ethnomusicological research, I expand on ethnomusicology, vocal pedagogy, religious studies, and musicological research on gender and sexuality in other genres pioneered by scholars such as Susan McClary, Suzanne Cusick, and Philip Brett to analyze gospel music making and Christian worship participation as sex. With attention to the ways in which men speak about music making while in the predominantly male gospel music networks, singing gospel is a multi-sensory sexual activity engaging the listener with musical semiotics, memory, iconicity, and embodied resonance inscriptions. Inspired by the climactic phrase of the refrain in the song I Give You Praise, the following questions are examined in this presentation. In what ways do Black male gospel musicians perceive their vocal sound and embodiment as a dwelling place, a construction of habitation and safe space that facilitates spiritual, physical, or even sexual transcendence through worship in a manner that resembles an orgasmic experience? More to the point, to what extent do Black male musicians tap into modes of eroticism to inform their facilitation of worship? Using an ethnographic sketch, I describe the musical event context of honoring consummate gospel composer Richard Smallwood. Has anyone ever heard of Richard Smallwood before today? Cool, okay, great. I will briefly explain the composer's significance among gospel musicians, focusing on the two male vocalists, B. Slade and Charles Anthony Bryant, who honored him. For them and many other musicians, Smallwood is a muse who exemplifies the weaving of gospel and Western European art music traditions. B. Slade embodied the complexities surrounding the reception of self-identified gay musicians in gospel music by presenting the sonic and gestural domains that have been attributed to queerness. In contrast, Charles Anthony Bryant challenges gospel audiences' assumptions about what queer potential or identity looks like and sounds like with regard to the vocal fach and comportment. With attention to the assumptions stemming from heteropatriarchal constructs of gender and sexuality expression in historically Black Protestant congregations and gospel music spheres, I summarize the symbolism derived from the male musical functions and vocal range domains within the worship leadership structure. I conclude by returning to the initial ethnographic sketch to demonstrate the dimensions of vocal production and how the activity moves the singer and participants, supporting the long-held sense that there are both latent and intentional meanings and intimacies that are cultivated in vocal performance. Informed by womanist and feminist modes of analysis, I conduct this research through the lens of what Black feminist Bell Hooks calls an oppositional gaze of Black male musicians. As a formally trained, cisgender woman preacher, musician, and researcher who is sexually and non-sexually attracted to men. I must admit that whenever I present my research on Black men's worship, I do so with a critical affirmation of traditions and participants that I both respect and challenge. In 2016, Pastors Willie and Mary Wilson of Union Temple Baptist Church, also known as Union Temple in Washington, D.C., contacted me to produce and develop education content for a tribute concert for gospel music composer Richard Smallwood and the late godfather of go-go music, Chuck Brown. Have you heard of Chuck Brown? Okay, great. During Black Music History Month. Both musicians are in the long line of Washingtonian composers and band leaders such as Edward Kennedy Duke Ellington, Jeffrey Mumford, Evelyn Simpson Currington, and George Walker, whose music illustrates and complicates the famous adage, "It don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing." Additionally, one should note that Richard Smallwood's father was the founding pastor of that church, Union Temple Baptist, and he was the founding director of the youth and young adult choir there. We actually unearthed some early recordings of his music that are not digitized, and I look forward to further exploration of those. Reverend Richard Smallwood is an important musical figure in the Washington, D.C. and national gospel music scenes as a craftsman of a distinct sound. His music has been performed in churches all over the world and incorporated into popular culture through cinematic productions such as Whitney Houston's cover of I Love the Lord in the film The Preacher's Wife. Have you seen that? Yeah. Even his good friend Aretha Franklin has referred to Smallwood's music as being the soundtrack to her worship. Many of the vocalists, pianists, conductors, and composers who I have interviewed have referred to Smallwood as an ideal embodiment of a formally trained musician in both the gospel music of the Black church, quote unquote, and the Western European art music taught in U.S. schools of music. In my May 2016 interview with him, Smallwood said that he began directing ensembles by covering music by his favorite gospel and secular music composers, such as Andre Crouch and the pioneering brothers in gospel music, Edwin and Walter Hawkins. I know some of the Californians may know of them. A contemporary of fellow Howard University alumna Roberta Flack and Donny Hathaway, Smallwood matriculated in the early 1970s during an era when African-American vernacular music was prohibited from being played on campus. His narrative indicates that historically Black colleges and universities, more commonly referred to as HBCUs, have and still privilege Eurocentric music education over Black vernacular musics such as jazz and gospel. Developed from his practice of musical discretion, Smallwood found ways to rehearse gospel, soul, and R&B in a style where he could seamlessly transition into his concert music repertoire so as to go undetected by the administrators and security in the HU Fine Arts Building practice rooms. To be found playing the vernacular music could mean expulsion for him at that time. In our initial conversation about this tribute, Pastor Wilson envisioned a celebration that would include a headlining tribute to Smallwood by a Wilson family friend, B. Slade, who they learned was a part of, is a muse of my research. Like Smallwood, he is principally a high-singing male vocalist with a range that spans from whistle tones into baritone range. His government name is Anthony Williams, but now, after various stage name changes, he has ended up as B. Slade, who is the first prominent openly gay gospel musician and ordained preacher to disclose his identity unapologetically in the gospel music industry. As a result of his unapologetic self-disclosure, he was rejected from several historically Black Pentecostal organizations and has since then developed a thriving career in pop music production performance. His inclusion in the program was significant because in my interviews with self-identified homosexual or same-gender loving men, Black men have mentioned him as symbolizing a break from the old school of the choir director stereotype. The stereotype is a trope of men about whom there have been much speculation surrounding their sexuality, but they have never confirmed or denied the rumors. In fact, it is their life cycles and seasons are noticeably absent. You know what I'm talking about? Yeah. It's noticeably absent from their public narrative, which is uncommon for gospel artists. They often talk about marriage, family, dating in their performances. This concert was a symbolic return home for B. Slade and the establishment of a conceivable safe space where a mixture of open and discreetly gay gospel music enthusiasts were invited and anticipated to attend the event at Union Temple Baptist Church. Another production task was to identify other talent that could best illustrate the subtleties of Smallwood's works, blending hymns, traditional contemporary gospel with Western European art musics. At the top of my list was a talented baritone named Charles Anthony Bryant, who is an emerging Washingtonian baritone with whom I've become acquainted through interviews and collaborations for my research. In addition to his versatile vocal ability as a formerly trained operatic singer and trans-denominationally trained worship leader in Black churches, I recall that he mentioned in our interviews the impact that Smallwood had on his musical formation as a youth in DC. Also, when I invited him, Brian told me that he was honored to sing for the pastor of the church who was there for him in very difficult times. I paired Bryant with Smallwood's longtime pianist, Anthony Tony Walker, to collaborate on a medley that drew from Smallwood's earlier works in the 1970s and 80s. We did this because on the radio, they don't typically play his music before 1998. So we wanted to basically introduce a new generation to earlier musics by this composer. I instructed them to interpret Smallwood's musical identities derived from the Black church and conservatory, which illustrated a turbulent voyage that actually all four of us have shared in common. We decided on 3 selections: I Give You Praise, My Everything, and Resurrection, which is a selection that references the vocalese by one of Smallwood's early influences, Russian composer and pianist Sergei Rachmaninoff. All 3 of these songs have been widely covered, even by his own icons, such as Edwin Hawkins. And just to give you a sense of how he has covered the song, I would like to play it for you just a little bit, if that's okay.
Jesus died for our sins. He hung high on a hill called Calvary to save a wretch
to stop it, but I at least wanted to get to a significant cadence for you all. I was like, oh, wait, if I stop it early, it might vex them. Let me not do that. That's the beauty of presenting before other musicians. All 3 of these songs have been widely covered, even by icons such as Edwin Hawkins. However, the resurrection became a means through which, unbeknownst to Smallwood, he would proselytize church musicians to pursue versatile exposure and musicianship. On the day of the concert, I met them at the church for their sound check. We conferred on the vocal styles and accompaniment textures that would be displayed in each selection. jazz, gospel, classical. Fully engaged in performance mode, Charles began soundcheck, and I live streamed parts of his rehearsal on my private Facebook page to entice people to attend the concert. I Give You Praise was the song that we discussed the most, since the piece was in a key that was too high for Bryant. Originally recorded by classically trained Ricky Valentino LaFontaine, the male solo in Smallwood's recording was composed for the tenor vocal designation. Bryant and Walker communicated about transposing the key before consenting to sing the song because Bryant knew Smallwood would notice the transposition. Also, Bryant was under the impression that Smallwood had quote-unquote perfect pitch. Consequently, Bryant was anxious that Smallwood would be distracted or even insulted by the key change, perceiving it to be an indication of inattentiveness to the details of the original work. However, the pianist Walker assured Bryant that Smallwood would prefer an effortless performance in a suitable key for a baritone. Walker's allowance is consistent with the gospel music oral tradition and performance practices in African American churches, in which all musicians are expected to transpose and play entire compositions in any key with little notice. No rehearsing in that sense. Moreover, the honoree is a trained vocalist in both the Western European art music and gospel. He understands Fox and vocal designations. With Walker's blessing, Bryant requested that he transpose the song from E minor G to B minor D major. With this backstory in mind, I was attuned to the vocal negotiations that Bryant would make. With regard to sonic texture, the initial recording featured a tenor and ensemble. Bryant decided to do it as a solo piece without an ensemble. Let us take a listen to this rehearsal. This was the first time I ever live streamed a rehearsal, and thank goodness I was able to get the footage because at that time they hadn't quite worked out the kinks of keeping the footage that you do from live stream. So here are the lyrics. Halfway down, or a third of the way down, this is where we find him singing, I Give You Praise. Again, I hate to stop it, but in the interest of time, I will fast forward to the reception of these two artists, B. Slade and Charles Anthony Bryant, in the concert. And I didn't show you a photo of B. Slade. Here is B. Slade. This is B. Slade. All righty. So yes, both of them were participants in the concert. Obviously, two different styles and presentations. They were met with different reception. One of the complaints was that the headliner, B. Slade's performance was too long and that the vibe did not fit. These remarks were accompanied with nonverbal communication intimating that he placed his sexuality and identity front and center in a manner that was inappropriate to the trans-denominational audience. While both of these men are openly and unapologetically gay music ministers, I contend that B. Slade's performance was met with resistance because he is a well-known gay man who was rejected from many congregations. He displayed ostensibly queer-coded tenor, vocal sound, and dance styles in his gospel performance, elements that are scrutinized in gospel settings. They are particularly evaluated all the time. In contrast, Bryant has disclosed his same gender-loving sexuality as well. However, his story is unfolding. They didn't really know about his story. He did not display conventionally queer or feminine-coded sonic or gestural styles in his gospel performance, yet I contend that Bryant did indeed place his sexuality front and center as well, but in a manner that was imperceptible to the gospel audience, uninitiated in the physical mechanics of sound production. His performance registered as conventional male worship and as a tonal illustration of that worship, signifying on a dwelling place or the transcendence one experiences through an encounter with the divine. During our production briefing, Charles Anthony Bryant received the most requests to return for the following season. One person described him as sounding like a real man in comparison to B. Slade, who was just too much. As an openly gay man in the Black church, Bryant has a heightened awareness about the extent to which his body is now inscribed and legible as he emits a vocal sound and displays a performance presentation that he refers to as quote-unquote butch. However, unlike tenors in church vocal music leadership structures, his baritone sonic persona is less likely to signify his queer potential in predominantly black gospel music contexts. He was recently an interviewee and the only featured vocalist in the BET documentary Holler If You Hear Me, Black and Gay in the Church that was screened at the White House. Having observed B. Slade's rejection from churches and the cancellation of his gospel music concerts years prior due to his self-disclosure as being a gay man, Bryant and I discussed his anxieties surrounding divulging his sexual orientation. Before the documentary was filmed, for example, he met with the pastor of the prominent New York Baptist church where he worked and met with his loved ones in Washington, D.C. to give them a heads up that he was, in essence, coming out in the media. And this particular church is heavily politically aligned and would be described as a part of the Black elite in many ways. In the following section, I examine pedagogical adages that Charles Anthony Bryant and a few other Black men mentioned regarding how vocal sound is made with skill, consistency, and balance, fashioning the body as a dwelling place for self-pleasure, God's spirit, and man's reflection. Drawing from vocal pedagogy training, as Bryant began to sing I Give You Praise, I observed his engagement with vocal technique through his noble and lifted posture, engaged breathing and positioning of the larynx, situating him to sing a seamless ascending line. The melody encompasses a melodic contour that is intended to reach the edge of his vocal range, inducing a plaintive, declamatory statement, "You are my dwelling place." The musical setting of the phrase, "You are my dwelling place," as a melodic ascent illustrates the biblical reference which often refers to an everyday habitation, the celestial or heaven, a place where God resides and to which humans ascend. As he improvised on the original melody and ascended the melodic line, adding an upper neighbor on the word dwelling that did not exist before, he provided tension in the harmony. And I observed the change in his body position as he did so. As the sound flowed from him and reverberated throughout the sanctuary, I saw Bryant do a subtle, gradual pelvic curl and a flexed hand gesture extending downward and outward. It was very discreet. In my experience as a voice teacher, vocalists are often trained to reference a grounded sensation in their lower body as they ascend vocally. For example, my conservatory voice professor taught me to think of singing through my feet as I sang repertoire with an upward interval leap as a strategy for emitting resonant sound. Another voice teacher told me to sing from my P sphincter. I had to think about that. I was 18. I didn't know what that was. I don't think he knew how to say what he wanted to say with, in any other way that wouldn't be. But I really was lost. Nevertheless, many vocalists work hard to make sure these physical adjustments that engage their imagination and somatic knowledge are undetectable to the uninitiated spectator and listener. Throughout my pedagogical training, I observed the voluntary and involuntary parameters for engaging this sense of groundedness in voice production. To demonstrate what this muscle engagement looks like, I will show you an animated footage of the structural activity involved in singing, comprised of muscle contraction and release during respiration and the activation of resonators. Singing is athletic. As you watch, note the connections in the musculature involved in respiration. Also observe the stimulation in the erogenous zones, such as the mouth, breast, groin, and sacrum, that are engaged throughout the singing activity. I'll only show you a little bit of it, but it does all sorts of views of the body. So let's see. And it's in French, so I won't make y'all translate. So let me advance it a little. So this is the pelvic floor. These would be equated with the erogenous zones, the larynx, activity in the larynx. Abdomen, and you see where the points are going. You get a sense of what we're talking about here, right? Okay, great. So, isn't it cool? Yeah. So here are some of the maxims that I've heard. Yeah, I'm gonna come back to this because I don't want y'all to be, drop the balls. That first one there. Okay. After the concert, I asked Bryant, what is his strategy for the placement of the passaggi, which is the Italian term that refers to the transition between vocal registers and singing. People work really hard to make that sonically imperceptible, especially as they ascend and descend in a melodic line. When I asked him this, he laughed. I provided him with some of the examples that I gave you in my experience. He hesitated, and then I assured him that he could say it how he was told. He said, well, and he laughed, what I was told was quite vulgar. I was told to sing from my balls. We both laughed nervously, and then we continued the conversation. I was like, all right, that's new. Okay, so stemming from the prevalence of musicians with formal and apprentice music training in Black church music ministry education that emphasizes oral transmission, there's a circulation of schools of thought surrounding good singing that is a combination of widely disseminated adages and experiences. Bryant explained that when he was taught these concepts as a college student at Morehouse, an all-male, historically Black college, he did not fully understand the points of reference because he was sexually abstinent. For Bryant to be instructed in the college setting as a conservative Black Christian believer was to subject himself to various modes of ridicule and vulnerability due to his sexual inexperience. Vocal pedagogy that evokes sexual experience and sensuality is dissonant with the far-reaching theology of holiness traditions that prohibit seeking arousal or sexually charged contemplation outside of heterosexual activity and partner-focused desire in marriage. The male musician's maxims are similar to the vulgar and sexually suggestive comments that my preacher colleagues have said to me. In actuality, their oratorical skills overlap with sung vocality in the African American oral tradition, as in other traditions. One male professor emeritus of homiletics, which is the study of preaching, confided he was taught in seminary that he has not preached well unless he has climaxed. A woman preacher admitted to me that when she preaches, she has to be careful because when she does it well, she notices that she is tender and open, very vulnerable sexually afterward. After encountering pushback from other women preachers when she divulged this occurrence, she decided not to disclose to anyone else the pleasures that she derives from pulpit ministry. I assert that there is an unspoken process that lies beneath the aura of sex looming around the phallogocentric heteronormative hierarchy of culture bearers in sacred and secular African American oral traditions. The above shared experience of arousal through orality illuminate a phrase that I have heard preachers and musicians say, quote, "Congregations secretly want their pastors to be a womanizer and their music ministers to be gay," end quote. Y'all must have heard this problematic quote. Initially, the phrase seemed like a contradistinction among the vocations in sexual orientation and gender expression. But in light of this new insight, I consider the phrase as an observation of the perceived dominance found in the domains of preachers and music ministers in male-centered worship leadership. As I discuss in the longer version of this paper, preachers occupy the symbolically dominant, hetero-presenting, virile and masculine space of the pulpit. Vocal musicians occupy the symbolically submissive, peculiar, quote-unquote soft and feminine spaces of the choir loft. You'll notice that instrumentalists are imagined to be an unmarked category, presumably heterosexual unless they cue otherwise in their presentation or interactions with others. Perhaps if these connections were analyzed and explained more explicitly, servant leaders in pulpit and choir loft would be prepared to manage the passions stimulated in orality. And so I'll just show you some of the other maxims and adages that I heard others say that their voice professors told them. The guys said that they heard things like drop your balls, imagine there's a weight attached to your balls, breathe your air in where you take your man in, squeeze your butt, which also cues a simulation in the anal area, an area that can be erect, and then lift your girls referring to breast, an erogenous zone, sing from your pubic hair, as a way of sensing the pelvic floor. Professor Marietta Simpson was happy to contribute that particular insight. She was like, quote me. I was like, all right, I will quote you. Following my interview with Bryant and other male vocalists, I reflected on the root of our anxiety around talking about the vocal pedagogy that we were taught and the sensations that we have assessed in our own bodies, predominantly in erogenous zones, to produce vibrant sound. In fact, my voice teacher at Oberlin told me, you mustn't sing unless you have something to sing about. You must feel it. I observed an opportunity to expand on the examination of the, quote, circulation of physical pleasure, end quote, in music that musicologist Suzanne Cusick described in her chapter on a lesbian relationship with music. And I have the quote, but in the interest of time, I'm going to, okay. Yes. So the quote is, a sexuality might be a person's position vis-a-vis the means of expressing and or enacting relationships of intimacy through physical pleasure shared, accepted, or given. For some of us, it might be that the most intense and important way we express or enact identity through circulation of physical pleasure is in musical activity, and that our sexual identity might be musician more than it is lesbian, gay, or straight. Be that the case or not, one might expect a significant amount of bleed-through between a person's musicality and a person's sexuality as conventionally defined, that is, as genitally focused enactment of intimacy through the circulation of pleasure. If music isn't sexuality, for the most of us, it is physically right next door. If our musicalities and our sexualities are physically next door neighbors, how might we experience a crossover between the two? End quote. In my interviews with male vocalists, I found frequent references to their musicalities and sexualities as more than next door neighbors. Since the music making is housed within the body and sounded using their body, their musicalities and sexualities are bedfellows. I explored the way vocal musicians' sensuality and the use of their bodies as a form of musical consumption, accessing sensory memory of smelling, ingesting, digesting, resonating, and squatting for sound production. That musical consumption is closely related to engaging various erogenous zones throughout the body to achieve vocal consistency and balance sought through training and vocal technique. The sound they emit is both music and human. Thus, sensuality is at the core of music making for these vocalists as they facilitate one of the most intimate practices, which is worshiping God in public. The meanings and understandings generated from the experiences may lead to the distribution of harmful stereotypes about Black men's sexual prowess, derived from stereotypes such as the big black buck, disseminated in the US popular imagination. The connections between Black male vocalists' sound and physical attributes, and even their sexuality, have been essentialized along racial lines, presuming that they are inclined toward hypersexuality and their vocal quality is a sonic indicator. For example, one African-American baritone, David Huey, told me that his European-American friend of a similar Fach, or vocal designation, discussed with him the distinctions between their two vocal qualities. His European-American friend inquired of their voice types to their professor, and he asked why Huey had a velvety, rich quality to his voice. The instructor told him, quote, "Don't worry, African Americans develop earlier sexually. That is all," end quote. Right. The professor's comment was insulting and baseless, reinscribing stereotypes that have plagued Black men and women since colonial times in the United States. In an illogical manner, he reduced Huey's timbral quality to developmental and hypersexual attributes, rather than, say, cultural formation and vocal style choices. The dominant perceptions of sounded Black creativity and the body in the US popular imagination trickle into Black churches, contributing to the internal sociocultural anxieties surrounding the performance of masculinity in gospel. Through Charles Anthony Bryant's baritone vocal performance, he deflects attention from the queer potential that would be scrutinized in the conventionally gendered role of male vocalist worship leadership. So, I'm going to go to my closing, which is this. In conclusion, I've examined B. Slade and Charles Anthony Bryant's tribute performance to the gospel music composer Richard Smallwood, a musician who is a muse to many musicians. The divergent reception of the tribute performances illuminated the vocal musicalities, sensualities, and sexualities that can be embodied in distinct yet powerful ways. I chose to analyze Bryant's discrete practice of self-pleasure to produce consistent and balanced vocal sound and reveal the subtleties of music's relationship to musicians' sexuality. Bryant's practice of drawing from sexually suggestive and vulgar maxims is a popular approach in various vocal pedagogies, not just African American ones. However, recognizing that the ill-informed use of these concepts may further distribute negative perceptions that essentialize Black men's physical attributes and sexual prowess along racial lines is instructive for our gathering here today. Despite anxieties about misconceptions in their apprenticeships, Black male singers such as Bryant derive personal, divine, and communal pleasure through their engaged and embodied sound production. By feeling and sounding fully through gospel vocal performance, Bryant and others sing music that moves listeners under the sound of their voice, which is a common phrase they like to say, symbolically transporting participants to the heavenlies, and a profound negotiation process of simultaneous self-giving, self-pleasure, and co-creation. Thank you. Thank you. Should I move or what should I do?
I think you should stand up
Okay.
and receive more of our praise.
You're funny.
Through individual and collective vocality. I think we have, I'm guessing we have maybe 15 or 20 minutes for comments, questions, discussion, and so I invite you all to
Hi.
respond to the call.
Hi.
Hi. Wonderful, thank you. And I work on earlier music in the 16th century, but I was really struck by your references to passaggi and that necessity to maintain the foundation. But something that really struck me with my own work, and I wondered if maybe if there's, the parallel seems to be there, is that there's this idea that with one style, where you maintain you execute a 3-octave range, you have to remain very still. And I always thought that was like, I mean, they're saying this, but that's sort of to get away from the sexual aspect of this aesthetic. I think the ecstatic sexual aspect, if you have to remain very still physically. But I've always wondered about that. It seemed to way into that.
Yeah, I heard it. Where are my OB people? Yeah, I heard adages like quietude of the body, do not move too far out this way, but bring them in toward you. Lift the key of your chest and stay there. Quietude of the body. Don't move suddenly. All of that. Listen, I'm Pentecostal. We move suddenly. So, but yeah. And even as we think of the ascent in early musics, this idea also of maintaining a parallel position with regard to the chin to the ground. So sometimes for the student, they may lift their head in an effort to catch the ascending line, but actually it works against them, making sure that they remain constant as the music flows through them. So with regard to sexuality and stimulation throughout the body, there's this idea of an outward quietude but there's also this contrary motion that I've experienced, and you may have had a different, because there are various schools of thought in pedagogy, where ostensibly it looks as though I am regal, I have quietude of the body, but I'm also taught to imagine squatting as I'm doing this. Does that sound familiar, or, yeah?
I'm not a singer, but I just felt like this stillness thing, that there was something a lot behind that wasn't being talked about. So I was That was useful.
I'll continue to think
Yeah.
of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Oh, so lovely. I would like to bring up some contradictory things and then put them together like that, and then something will happen with it. Maybe not. I don't know. I was thinking about Brian's performance, and I was sort of struck by the ways in which his sound sort of evoked sort of Western classical music, sort of like a kind of a white. You know what I'm saying? Sort of not always, but there are moments, especially when we start hitting higher notes. I was like, oh, this is your, like, you are sort of sharing with us a particular kind of classical musicianship, which is red and white. And this made me think of two contradictory things. One is, which, if you think about black and whiteness, right, you get the mind-body split, where white people are the mind and black people are the body. And so therefore, white people are not then, do not have sexuality, right? So they don't have sexuality, so by evoking a classical style, that can then efface, right, sexuality, because white people don't have sexuality, where black people all have sexuality, right? So by using that particular vocal style, that sort of removes him from sexuality, but then the contradiction would be, I'm sure you've heard, that there are only, gay people are only white, right? There are no black gay people. Gayness is only in white communities, somehow. And so there's this kind of interesting sort of set of contradictions in that particular performance that he's giving, where on one hand, by accessing whiteness, you get the lack of body, and so therefore that sort of moves away from queerness. But on the other hand, queerness is sort of projected onto whiteness as a white thing and not somehow indigenous to blackness. And I was wondering what you could do with those things.
Yeah. So I get at that a little differently. I am curious about gendered sound and racialized perceptions of gendered sound. In the longer version that I swiped through, I talk about domains, vocal range, domains as in spaces within worship settings, roles within worship settings, and vocal sound within worship settings, that as we look at oral traditions, stories that people tell, jokes that people tell, they are gendered and sexualized in particular ways. For example, if you look at memes about gospel choirs and vocal parts, there's often a joke about the tenor voice. I'm a tenor and what are you sort of things, or I had a crush on him, the meme goes, but then I saw he was in the tenor section. The joke being that he might be presumed to be gay or homosexual or queer. A lot of the men that I worked with in these settings do prefer terms like homosexual, FYI. The older ones, same gender loving. So I get at it through vocal range, spaces in the settings, and then when these musicians who are multicultural in these ways go back and forth between the concert stage and the worship setting, and they see what is permitted with their colleagues of various socioeconomic statuses and racial identities. They see their experiences, their receptions, and start to do a comparison, but then also adjust their music competencies in order to make a living in multiple settings. So I get at it in that way, just comparing the settings, the reception, and then their remarks on how their friends who are of a different identity, racial, socioeconomic, how they get received, and denominationally. Because a lot of the countertenors, I have a piece that I do on countertenors, a lot of the countertenors talk about facilitating worship in Baptist congregations versus, doing worship in an Anglican church. And even those who have disclosed their identity as gay men, just the disidentification that they deal with as they go back and forth, which I would love to talk at length about. Yeah. Thank you. Yes. Absolutely. Didn't I want to go into it? I wanted to go into it, but yes.
Kind of bringing me and some of the questions together, at least how they exploded excitingly in my mind. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about class, because you used the word elite at one point to describe this particular But I was fascinated by the history, even just the glimpse that I got of the way that you said HBCUs used to prohibit Black music traditions being sung, and I think of a sort of whole vote, here comes back to me, this question, like the one voice from bottom to top, right, is that specifically Euro-American tradition. So are there manifestations of gospel and practices that do use the break and kind of play with the break?
Oh,
is
yes.
there a way to think about class through that? That's a lot, but that's really
Yeah. So let's think, from my experience as a formerly trained musician who actually prefers my instrument in concert musics, class becomes an issue in terms of livelihood and longevity, relying on that gift. My use of it in this, because I didn't name the church, but I did name the city, you could probably deduce which congregation it is. This particular congregation is known for being sort of within African American culture, old guard sort of pulpit in terms of who is pastored, who has attended, like the amount of books on various scholars who have done activism through this particular congregation. So I am, even as I'm trying to keep it anonymous, I am cueing how his status in that congregation and his self-disclosure could jeopardize what others covet in terms of how he was being positioned. Also, it's important to me, and my colleagues in African American studies have really pushed me in this area to lift up class, because in many ways people don't imagine African Americans as being anything other than working class, than middle class, upper middle class, wealthy. And so to talk about class, to talk about how intraculturally we deal with it is an important mode of analysis for me, especially someone who's been formally trained in vocations that are contested within my community, that formal training being perceived as a luxury in many ways. Divinity school, conservatory, at predominantly white institutions. So yes, there is a political move there, and exposing people to the broader imagination of what African American professionals look like. And a footnote to that is, as the director of this institution mentioned earlier, as we think of issues like Black Lives Matter, for me as a scholar, it's important to lift up the myriad ways in which people identify that not only go along racial lines, gender lines, regional lines, but class lines. Sometimes there is a cognitive dissonance in how to be in solidarity with professional African Americans in issues of inclusion and solidarity, an inability to read, and illegibility with regard to folks who come from a long line of doctors or lawyers, and how they are excluded due to race. So that's another reason why I lift up class. Does that make sense? Did I answer your question? That was the footnote, the last part. Yes. William, oh, sorry. Okay.
Thanks so much, Alicia. I loved your multi-sensory reading of pleasure and voice. And as I look at some of these maxims, some of them sound a bit painful as well. I mean, I can't take my eyes off of the weight.
Right.
Not that I've spent the last 20 minutes imagining that.
Right.
But I wanted to kind of get back to kind of Nina and Stefan's questions about whether there's a racing of these maxims. And you brought up Black Lives Matter, and I'm thinking of the racial empathy gap and how
I'm sorry, I missed
the racial empathy gap.
Okay,
That's just what maybe some people call it. The idea that, like one study said that children starting at age 7 believe that they're black peers don't feel as much physical pain as their white counterparts. Doctors, study after study, it's shown that doctors they underprescribe pain medication to black patients. And of course it was this kind of idea of the resilient black body plays out currently in Cage, and it was an apologia for chattel slavery. But some of these seem, I wanted to kind of ask a question about whether there's a BDSM kink component to it, but I'm thinking more now about whether there is a racialized misimagination of pain, because we could tie it to kind of church discourses of penance, even of flagellation, but the idea that you need to dig deep and actually imagine a physical, not groundedness, because that sounds so positive, but almost like like a descent or pulling down of your body, as if there's you're resisting the devil's pull downwards, so that your voice can soar upwards towards God. And it seems like beyond pleasure, there's also this component of pain, and that the two must coexist just like they do in traditional and gospel preachings and discourses of repentance, of transcendence, of taking the good with the bad, of sinning and absolution.
Yeah, so, no, that's fine. No, I'm thinking with you right now. One of the tools that's helpful for me in these sorts of conversations around imagination, perception, pleasure, and a reading of Pentecostal holiness, conservative Black Christian anxieties, is the ways that as folks are trying to avoid being sexually explicit, they miss the mark. So instead of saying peace sphincter, which would stimulate in a particular way on the spectrum, there's this way of missing the mark where we get because it is an avoidance of saying something that might be too sexually suggestive, but still getting toward the region that should be stimulated, the region that should heighten some affect of some sort in a vivid way. They can't say orgasmic, but they can say wait. Now, I'm not saying it is the most beneficial or effective, but I do a lot of work around how these anxieties are revealed in speech, and how people, as they're trying to discourage sexual activity, say things about reproduction, anatomy, sex itself, that is not true to their lived experience. But they're trying to impress upon, their conversation partners some strong perceptions and sensations in a way that is not too sexually inappropriate. And in doing so, it misses the mark. It does miss the mark. And I would be happy to talk about some of those other ways that I've noticed that's illogical. But I know what you were trying to get at. But no, the anatomy doesn't work that way. But I get what you were trying to get me to do. But no, yeah. So does that answer? I think it's an issue of anxieties that does render painful imagery. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Could I just add something in spite of that? Branding in Black fraternities, and perhaps this being a working through of anxiety of slavery in certain ways. Like you sort of brought this up as in thinking about, especially with all the anxieties about Black masculinity and emasculation, slavery and all, and then sort of the idea of the Black man as violent, right? And so the ways in which Black masculinity is always sort of very fraught. And then Black communities, especially Black men, end up working through slavery in these really strange ways by then branding themselves in their fraternities or having
And
weights.
the keloid.
Right,
component.
in the keloids, right?
Yeah.
Or having a weight attached to your balls, since this sort of seasoning is not only just physical beating, but also sexual, sort of gay sexual assaults, right? And so, I mean, I wonder if there's something about sort of going on, sort of being inspired by your comment in here about this unworked through trauma, trauma of sexual and physical trauma of slavery that always lingers because we can never talk about it, right? We can't talk because 1865 everything's great, or 1965 everything's great, and so then we never are able to work through, right, the kinds of, I mean, both for, not only for men but also for women, and so then you get, when all the stereotypes are still there, right, so then maybe this weight attached to your balls, right, so it ends up evoking this real.
And I would add, in addition to the anxiety and reclamation or mastery of the body that occurs through those practices, I would also say that there's an avoidance of homoeroticism that is at play as the men and women talked about the gendered and sexualized dynamics between them and the instructor and the identity of the instructor, which I didn't want to focus on that. For our purposes, I wanted to focus on the nature of these maxims, but I also think what is at work is anxiety about the intimacies, potential intimacies that was perceived between student and teacher. Mm-hmm.